So, how was playing dress up today, Emma? My father asked as I walked through the door that Tuesday afternoon, still wearing the navy blazer and pencil skirt I'd carefully selected that morning for my interview. He didn't look up from his laptop at the kitchen table, fingers still typing, as if the question was barely worth the breath it took to ask it. My younger brother Jake snorted into his coffee mug, and I felt the familiar heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. "It was an interview, Dad," I said quietly, setting my portfolio bag down by the stairs. "A real interview with Apex Technologies." He finally glanced up, and I saw that look I'd come to know too well over the past 6 months since I'd finished my master's degree. That mixture of pity and dismissal that made me feel about 6 years old. "Apex," he repeated, almost smiling. "And what administrative position were you interviewing for?" The assumption stung because it wasn't really a question at all. "Data analyst," I managed, hating how small my voice sounded. "Senior data analyst, actually." Jake laughed outright at that. "Senior position? Emma, you just graduated. That's not how it works." He was 23, 3 years younger than me, and he'd been working at First National Bank for 18 months in a job my mother's college roommate had helped him get, but somehow he'd become the expert on how careers worked. My father nodded along with Jake's assessment, closing his laptop now that the conversation had apparently become interesting enough to warrant his full attention. "Your brother's right. You need to be realistic about your qualifications. That master's degree might look good on paper, but employers want experience, not expensive daydreaming." Expensive daydreaming. He'd used that exact phrase at least a dozen times since I'd started my graduate program in data science, as if the $80,000 in tuition, most of which I'd covered with scholarships, assistantships, and loans, had been some frivolous indulgence rather than an investment in my future. My mother walked in from the living room, dish towel in her hands, and offered me a weak smile. "I'm sure you did your best, sweetie," she said, which was somehow worse than saying nothing at all, because it carried the same assumption they all shared: that my best wouldn't be good enough, that I was destined to disappoint, that I should start lowering my expectations now to soften the inevitable rejection. I stood there in the kitchen of the house I'd grown up in, the house I'd moved back to after graduation because it seemed practical while job searching, and I felt the weight of their collective doubt pressing down on my shoulders like a physical thing. The past 6 months had been an endless accumulation of moments just like this one, each small dismissal building on the last, until I sometimes wondered if my father might actually be right about me. I'd graduated in December with my master's degree in data science from Northwestern, finishing with a 3.9 GPA and a thesis on predictive modeling for supply chain optimization that my advisor, Dr. Rahman, had called publishable quality. But my father had skipped the graduation ceremony because of a work conflict, and when I'd shown him my diploma later that week, he'd glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds before saying something about how the real test would be whether I could actually get someone to pay me for all that theory. The job market had been tighter than I'd expected, I could admit that, and each rejection email felt like confirmation of something my father had been suggesting since I'd first told him I wanted to pursue graduate school: that I was being impractical, that I was reaching beyond what I was capable of, that I should have followed a safer path like Jake had done. 2 weeks ago, we'd hosted dinner for my Aunt Carol and Uncle Jim, and I'd sat at that table listening to my father talk about Jake's recent promotion to assistant branch manager at the bank, watching him beam with pride as he described Jake's natural leadership abilities and good head for business. And when Uncle Jim had politely asked what I was up to, my father had said, "Emma's still figuring things out." As if I were some directionless teenager rather than a 26-year-old woman with 2 degrees and a specific career focus. I'd excused myself from the table and gone upstairs to my childhood bedroom, where my cum laude undergraduate certificate hung next to my master's diploma, where my academic achievement awards were arranged on the bookshelf, where the acceptance letter from Northwestern's competitive data science program was tucked in my desk drawer. All these physical proofs of my capability that my father had never once acknowledged as impressive. The interview today had been with Apex Technologies, which I knew from my research was one of the major players in enterprise data analytics, a company that worked with Fortune 500 clients and had been named one of the fastest growing tech firms in the region for 3 consecutive years. And I'd prepared for 2 full days, reviewing my portfolio projects, rehearsing answers to technical questions, making sure I could speak confidently about my thesis research and how it applied to real world business problems. But standing in that kitchen watching my father dismiss it all as playing dress up made me feel like everything I'd worked for was somehow invisible, like my accomplishments only existed in some alternate reality that my family couldn't perceive. My father had worked at TechCore Industries for 22 years, starting as a junior systems engineer fresh out of college and climbing his way up through sheer determination and long hours to his current position as senior operations manager. And those 22 years of corporate success had given him an unshakable confidence in his own professional judgment that extended far beyond the walls of his office. He knew how businesses worked. He would tell anyone who'd listen. He understood what employers really wanted, what made candidates valuable, what separated the people who actually succeeded from the ones who just had fancy degrees and unrealistic expectations. And this self-assured expertise is what he brought to bear on me the morning after my Apex interview when I made the mistake of coming downstairs to find him reading the business section over coffee. "Emma, sit down for a minute," he said, folding the newspaper and looking at me with that expression I'd learned meant he was about to share wisdom he considered important, whether I wanted to hear it or not. "I've been thinking about your job search, and I want to give you some advice because I don't think you're approaching this correctly." I sat, coffee mug in hand, already feeling my shoulders tensing. "You're aiming too high," he continued, his tone matter of fact, as if he were simply explaining an obvious truth I was too inexperienced to see. "These senior analyst positions, the ones at companies like Apex, they're not entry-level roles no matter what the posting says. They want people with 3, 5, 7 years of practical experience, not someone fresh from grad school. You're setting yourself up for disappointment, and worse, you're wasting time you could be spending building actual experience." He leaned forward, warming to his subject now. "What you should be doing is looking at administrative positions, maybe junior analyst roles if you're lucky. Something where you can get your foot in the door and prove yourself from the ground up like I did. That's how careers are built. You start at the bottom, you work hard, you earn your promotions. You don't just walk in and expect to be handed a senior title because you wrote some academic papers." The word "some" stung particularly because my thesis had taken 14 months of intensive research and had been presented at 2 conferences. But in my father's assessment, it was reduced to some academic papers, as if I'd turned in a few book reports. "And your interview skills need work," he added, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and still. "You probably come across as too academic, too theoretical. Hiring managers want to see that you understand business realities, not just textbook concepts. You're probably intimidating them with all that graduate school terminology instead of speaking their language." I wanted to ask him how he knew anything about my interview skills, since he'd never once practiced an interview with me or asked me detailed questions about how my interviews had gone. But I said nothing because I'd learned that defending myself only extended these conversations. "I'm telling you this because I care about your future," he said, sitting back with the satisfied air of someone who'd done his fatherly duty. "You need to be realistic, lower your expectations, and focus on what you can actually achieve at this stage of your career." Part of me knew he was wrong, knew that my qualifications were strong and my interview yesterday had gone well, but there was still that small, persistent voice inside me that wondered if maybe he was right, if maybe I was delusional about my own abilities, if maybe his 22 years of corporate experience really did give him insights I lacked. That night at dinner, my mother mentioned that Martin Chen, my father's boss and the VP of operations at TechCore, would be coming over the following week for dinner, and my father spent 20 minutes talking about how important it was to make a good impression, how Martin's opinion could make or break careers at the company, how he'd been working on a strategic initiative that Martin was particularly interested in. And I watched him speak with such pride about his professional relationships and his standing at TechCore, and I felt the familiar ache of knowing that he would never speak about me with that same tone of pride, that in his eyes I would always be the disappointment, the one who aimed too high and didn't understand her own limitations. The email arrived at 10:47 the next morning while I was sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to review job postings on my laptop, but actually just staring blankly at the screen, still feeling the residual sting of my father's dress-up comment from the night before. And when my inbox refreshed and I saw the sender name, Apex Technologies, Talent Acquisition, my heart lurched so violently I actually gasped out loud. The subject line read, Second Interview Invitation, Senior Data Analyst Position, and my hands were shaking as I clicked it open, my eyes racing over the words faster than I could actually process them, and then I read it again slowly. They wanted me to come back for a second interview, this time with the senior leadership team, including Dr. Patricia Woods, their CEO, and could I make myself available Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m.? I sat there staring at my laptop screen, feeling this dangerous bubble of hope expanding in my chest. The kind of hope that felt almost painful because I'd been disappointed so many times before. And my first instinct was to run upstairs and tell my mother, to share this moment with someone. But then I heard Jake's voice from the living room talking on his phone about some meeting at the bank and using that casual, confident tone that came so easily to him. And I remembered how he'd smirked last night when our father made his playing dress-up joke, and I closed my laptop quietly and kept the email to myself. My mother came into the kitchen a few minutes later and found me still sitting there, and she smiled that gentle, worried smile she'd been giving me for 6 months and said, "Are you okay, sweetie? I'm sure you'll find something eventually, dear. You just have to be patient." And her well-meaning encouragement somehow felt worse than my father's outright dismissal, because at least his cruelty was honest. But I just nodded and said I was fine, and went upstairs to my room where I could think without anyone offering me their useless sympathy. I spent the next 3 hours researching everything I could find about Apex Technologies, diving deep into their corporate structure, their client list, their recent projects and press releases, and that's when I discovered something that made my pulse quicken. Apex and TechCore Industries, my father's company, had a complex business relationship that was part competition and part collaboration, with Apex providing specialized data analytics services to TechCore while simultaneously competing for some of the same corporate clients. I found articles about joint projects, quotes from executives at both companies praising their partnership, mentions of TechCore being one of Apex's largest clients, and I sat back in my desk chair realizing that these two companies my father considered himself such an expert on were deeply interconnected, and Apex was actually the more innovative and faster growing of the two. I replied to the email accepting the Thursday interview time, keeping my response professional and enthusiastic, but not desperate. And as I hit send, I felt that hope continuing to grow despite my attempts to contain it, and then immediately felt guilty, because part of what I was imagining was the look on my father's face if I actually got this position, the vindication of proving him wrong. And I hated that my motivation was getting tangled up with wanting to show him, rather than just wanting the job for myself. But I couldn't separate those two desires, no matter how much I knew I should. Thursday morning, I told my family I was going to the library to work on some applications, and my father didn't even look up from his tablet where he was reviewing some report for work, just made a vague acknowledging sound, and I walked out the door in my best interview suit, hidden under a long coat, feeling like I was sneaking out to do something illicit rather than going to potentially the most important meeting of my professional life. The Apex Technologies headquarters was downtown, in one of those gleaming glass towers that always made me feel simultaneously intimidated and ambitious. And I arrived 20 minutes early and sat in my car, giving myself a pep talk, reviewing my portfolio one final time, reminding myself that they wouldn't have called me back if they didn't see something worth pursuing. The lobby was all polished concrete and minimalist design, and when I checked in at reception, the woman smiled warmly and said, "Ms. Morrison, they're expecting you." And something about being expected, rather than being an inconvenience, steadied my nerves as I rode the elevator to the 14th floor. I was led to a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, and waiting inside were four people who stood as I entered. Dr. Patricia Woods, the CEO, who I recognized from my research, a man who introduced himself as David Park, Director of Analytics, and two other senior team members whose titles I barely registered because my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. They started with technical questions, and I mean really technical, asking me to walk through my approach to a specific machine learning problem they'd been grappling with. And I pulled out my portfolio and showed them a similar challenge I'd addressed in my thesis research, explaining my methodology step by step, using the whiteboard to diagram the data pipeline I would construct. And I watched their faces shift from polite interest to genuine engagement as I talked about ensemble methods and feature engineering and cross-validation strategies. Dr. Woods leaned forward and asked me how I would handle a dataset with significant missing values and class imbalance, which was exactly the kind of problem I'd spent months solving in my graduate research. And I walked her through my approach with specific examples and the statistical reasoning behind each decision. And when I finished, she exchanged a look with David Park that I couldn't quite read, but that made my stomach flip with hope. "We've been burned before," Dr. Woods said, her tone frank and assessing, "by candidates who have impressive resumes and can talk a good game. But when it comes to actually implementing solutions, they don't have the depth of understanding required. So forgive us for putting you through the ringer, but we need to know that you can actually do this work, not just discuss it theoretically." I met her eyes and said I understood completely, and I welcomed any technical challenge they wanted to throw at me, because I knew my research was solid and my skills were real. And for the next 45 minutes, they did exactly that, presenting me with scenario after scenario. And I answered each one drawing on my academic work and the practical applications I'd explored in my projects. And by the end, I felt like I'd run a marathon. But I also felt alive and electric because I knew I'd performed brilliantly. I could see it in their faces and in the way they were nodding and taking notes. When we finally wrapped up, Dr. Wood stood and shook my hand firmly and said, "Emma, this has been one of the most impressive interviews I've conducted in a long time. We'll be in touch very soon." And the meaningful eye contact she gave me as she said it felt like a promise. And as I walked back to my car, I had to resist the urge to call someone, anyone, to share what had just happened. But I made myself stay quiet and hold this close because I couldn't bear the thought of my father finding some way to diminish it before I even knew the outcome. The 3 days that followed that interview were an exquisite form of torture, each hour stretching impossibly long while I checked my email compulsively every 15 minutes and tried to act normal around my family. And my father made it worse without even knowing what he was doing because he was in the middle of preparing for some major presentation at TechCore that had him stressed and irritable. And his stress manifested as these pointed comments about work ethic and earning your place that were clearly aimed at me, even though he never said my name directly. I was sitting at the kitchen table on Saturday morning, my laptop open to my inbox, which I'd already refreshed approximately 30 times, when he came downstairs in his weekend clothes, but carrying his work bag, and he started making coffee while talking to my mother about this presentation he had to give on Monday for Martin Chen, his boss, the VP of Operations whose name I'd heard roughly 1,000 times over the years because my father dropped it constantly like some kind of credential. "Martin's really going to be scrutinizing every department's performance," my father said, his voice tight with the particular anxiety he got about impressing his superiors. "And operations has to show we're staying ahead of the efficiency curve, which is harder than it sounds when you've got competitors like Apex poaching our potential innovations." I looked up sharply at the mention of Apex, but my father wasn't even looking at me, just stirring his coffee with more force than necessary. Kids these days think they can just walk into a senior position without paying their dues, he continued, and now he did glance in my direction. They don't understand that you have to work your way up, prove yourself over years, not just show up with a degree and expect everyone to be impressed. Jake wandered in at that moment and immediately nodded in agreement like he always did, saying, "Yeah, I started at the bank in basically an entry-level role, and I've had to work for every promotion," which was technically true, except that he'd gotten the job in the first place, through my mother's college friend, who was a regional manager, a fact that everyone conveniently forgot when they were lecturing me about earning opportunities. I closed my laptop and left the kitchen without saying anything because I couldn't trust myself to stay civil, and I went back to my room and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling, feeling that familiar mixture of hurt and anger and determination that had become my default emotional state. Monday came and went with no email. Tuesday, I barely slept, just kept my phone on my nightstand and checked it every time I woke up in the night. Wednesday morning at 9:23 a.m., my inbox refreshed and there it was. Sender name, Dr. Patricia Woods, Apex Technologies, and subject line, Offer of Employment, Senior Data Analyst Position. And I opened it with shaking hands and read the first line, which said, "Dear Emma, we are delighted to offer you the position of Senior Data Analyst." And my eyes jumped down to the compensation section where I saw $95,000 annual salary plus performance bonus potential of up to 15% and stock options vesting over 4 years. And I read the entire letter 5 times in a row because I needed to be absolutely certain this was real. That I wasn't misunderstanding something, that this was actually happening to me. I sat there staring at the offer letter on my screen with tears streaming down my face, and they were complicated tears. A mixture of triumph and relief, and this deep, aching sadness that the first emotion I felt wasn't pure joy, but rather this immediate anxiety about telling my family, about how my father would find some way to diminish this, or dismiss it, or make it about everything I'd done wrong, instead of what I'd done right. I read the letter a 6th time, then a 7th, memorizing the exact wording of Dr. Woods's praise, the specific numbers in the compensation package, the official Apex Technologies letterhead, gathering evidence to prove to myself that this was real and substantial and mine. I wanted to run downstairs and show them, to see my father's face when he realized how wrong he'd been. But even in this moment of achievement, I could hear his voice in my head finding problems, questioning details, suggesting I didn't understand what I was signing. So instead, I closed my laptop and grabbed my phone and called Maya, my best friend since college, who'd seen me through every moment of doubt and dismissal over the past months. And when she answered, I couldn't even speak at first, just made this choked sound, and she immediately said, "Emma, what's wrong?" With such concern that I started laughing through my tears and said, "I got it, Maya. I got the job." She screamed so loud, I had to pull the phone away from my ear, and then she was asking me everything at once, the salary and the title and the start date, and when I told her 95,000 plus bonuses, she screamed again and said, "Emma, that's incredible. That's more than your dad makes, isn't it?" And I realized she was right. That my starting salary fresh from grad school was higher than what my father earned after 22 years at TechCore. And that thought made something twist in my chest, because I knew he would hate that. Maya was still talking, saying I needed to march downstairs right now and make him eat every single dismissive word he'd ever said to me. But I told her I couldn't, not yet, that I needed to accept the offer first, and get everything finalized and in writing before I said anything, because I couldn't bear the thought of him finding some way to talk me out of it or convince me I was making a mistake. I spent the next hour crafting my acceptance email, keeping it professional and gracious, and when I hit send, I felt this surge of finality, of commitment, of stepping into a future I'd built entirely on my own. The response came back within 30 minutes with a welcome packet attached, and my official start date of 3 weeks from Monday. and I downloaded every document and saved them in multiple places, like I was gathering evidence for a trial. That evening, I sat on my bed surrounded by printouts of my offer letter and employment contract, researching how to tell my family, actually Googling phrases like how to share good news with unsupportive parents. And I felt pathetic and angry at myself, because this should have been the happiest day of my professional life. And instead, I was strategizing how to defend my achievement from my own father. I realized then that I'd spent so many years feeling invisible in my own family, feeling like nothing I accomplished would ever matter as much as Jake's most basic achievements. And even now, with proof of my worth literally printed out in front of me, my father's voice in my head was louder than my own sense of pride. I decided I would tell them at dinner the next night, that I would say it clearly and calmly, and I wouldn't let him take this from me. And I rehearsed different ways of framing it until I finally fell asleep, with my offer letter still clutched in my hand. The next evening, I walked into the dining room, where my family was already sitting down to dinner, my mother setting out the casserole dish while my father was mid-sentence about something that happened at TechCore, and Jake was nodding along, and I stood there for a moment gathering my courage before I said, "I have some news," loud enough that everyone stopped and turned to look at me. My mother's face lit up with that hopeful expression she got whenever she thought something good might happen, and she said, "What is it, honey?" While my father set down his fork with this look of mild curiosity, mixed with the kind of skepticism he always had when I was about to say anything about my job search. I sat down in my usual seat and took a breath and said, "I got a job offer." And for just a second, my mother looked genuinely delighted and said, "Oh, Emma, that's wonderful." And even Jake said, "Congrats," in this tone that was maybe 70% sincere. But then my father leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed and said, "What company?" in this voice that made it clear he was already preparing to find problems. "Apex Technologies," I said, keeping my voice steady, "for a senior data analyst position." And I watched my father's expression shift from skeptical interest to outright disbelief. And then he actually laughed. Not a happy laugh, but this short bark of dismissive amusement. And he said, "Apex? Emma, Apex doesn't hire people straight out of grad school for senior positions. Are you sure you read the offer correctly?" I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice calm and said, "I'm sure, Dad. I interviewed with them twice, including with their CEO, and they offered me a senior analyst role." And he was shaking his head before I even finished speaking, his expression shifting from amused to almost angry, like I was insulting his intelligence. "Emma, I've worked in this industry for 22 years," he said, his voice taking on that lecturing tone I'd heard my entire life. "I know how corporate hiring works, and what you're describing doesn't happen. Senior positions require years of experience. They must have told you something different, and you misunderstood. Or this is some kind of contract recruiting situation, not an actual employee position." Jake jumped in then, of course he did, saying, "Yeah, Em, are you sure it's not like a temporary thing, or maybe they said you'd work up to senior level?" And my mother was looking between us with this worried expression, and she said, "Emma, honey, are you certain about the details?" And I felt that horrible familiar feeling of being surrounded by people who were supposed to support me, but instead immediately assumed I was wrong, or confused, or being naive. "I have the offer letter," I said, and my father waved his hand dismissively and said, "Let me see it." "I'll tell you what it actually says." But I didn't move to get my laptop because I suddenly realized that nothing I showed him would matter, that he would find some way to dismiss it or explain why it wasn't what I thought it was. And he was still talking, saying, "Emma, I'm trying to help you here. You need to understand that if something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. And I don't want you to get scammed or accept something that isn't a real position." And the worst part was that his voice almost sounded concerned, like he genuinely believed he was protecting me from my own stupidity, rather than refusing to acknowledge that I might have actually succeeded at something he'd told me was impossible. I left the dinner table without saying another word and went straight to my room, closing the door behind me with more force than I intended. And I sat on my bed with my hands shaking from anger and hurt, and this bone-deep exhaustion that came from a lifetime of this exact treatment, this pattern of dismissal and condescension that had colored every achievement I'd ever tried to share with my father. I thought about every award ceremony he'd missed, every academic honor he'd diminished with a comment about how grades didn't matter in the real world, every time he'd compared me unfavorably to Jake, whose accomplishments were always celebrated, while mine were always qualified with some critique or concern or suggestion that I didn't really understand what I'd achieved. I pulled out my laptop and looked at my offer letter again, at the official Apex Technologies letterhead and Patricia Woods' signature and the salary figure that was higher than what my father made after 2 decades in the industry, and I realized with sudden clarity that nothing I showed him would ever be enough, that I could walk downstairs right now with a signed contract and a business card and a letter from the CEO herself, and he would still find some way to explain why it wasn't what I thought it was, or why I should be cautious, or why his 22 years of experience meant he knew better than the people who had actually interviewed me and offered me the position. So I made a decision right there, sitting on my bed, surrounded by the certificates and diplomas he'd never once displayed proudly or mentioned to his colleagues. I wasn't going to try to convince him anymore. I was going to accept this job and start this new chapter of my life and let my actual lived experience speak for itself. And if he never believed me or never acknowledged what I'd accomplished, that would be his loss and his failure, not mine. The next 2 weeks passed in this strange, cold tension where my father would make occasional comments about my supposed job at Apex, actually using air quotes with his fingers when he said it, and I heard him on the phone with his brother, saying that I'd fallen for something that sounded too good to be true, and he was worried I was going to be disappointed when I found out it wasn't a real position. I stopped responding to these comments, just let them wash over me while I quietly packed my belongings, because the offer had included relocation assistance of $3,000, and I'd found a small one-bedroom apartment closer to Apex's office building. And when I told my mother I was moving out 1 week before my start date, she cried and asked if this was really necessary, and couldn't I just commute from home, and my father said I was running away from reality and making impulsive decisions based on something I didn't fully understand. Jake barely reacted when I said goodbye, just gave me this look that was half pity and half indifference, like he felt sorry for me, but also couldn't be bothered to really care. And as I loaded the last box into my car and drove away from the house I'd grown up in, I felt this mixture of grief and relief and determination that settled somewhere deep in my chest like a stone I'd been carrying for years that I was finally ready to set down. My first day at Apex Technologies started on a Monday morning in early September, and I remember walking into the glass-fronted building in downtown with my new employee badge clipped to my jacket and feeling like I was stepping into a different version of my life, one where I actually belonged somewhere and people valued what I could do. The office was nothing like the cramped, depressing spaces I'd imagined during my months of unemployment. It was all open floor plans with natural light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, collaborative spaces with whiteboards covered in equations and diagrams, and a coffee bar that served actual good coffee instead of the burned sludge my father brought home in a thermos every night. My supervisor, David Park, met me in the lobby with a warm handshake and a genuine smile, and as he walked me through the office introducing me to team members who actually looked up from their work to welcome me and ask about my background, I felt this knot of anxiety I'd been carrying for months start to slowly loosen. David took me to his office and spent an hour going over my onboarding schedule, but more importantly, he told me directly that they'd hired me specifically for my thesis research on predictive algorithms and my skills in machine learning applications, that they'd reviewed dozens of candidates with more years of experience, but my academic work had demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking they needed, and hearing him say that made me realize how much I'd internalized my father's voice telling me I wasn't ready or qualified or good enough. I met Dr. Patricia Woods again when David brought me by her office to say hello, and she stood up from her desk and shook my hand and said she was excited to see what I'd contribute, and there was nothing dismissive or patronizing in her tone, just straightforward professional respect that I wasn't used to receiving. That entire first week was immersive and challenging and exhausting in the best way. I was assigned to a team working on data optimization for client systems, and they handed me real substantial work immediately. Not busy work or training exercises, but actual analysis that would be presented to clients. And I stayed late every evening that week, not because anyone pressured me, but because I was genuinely engaged with problems that mattered and colleagues who treated my input as valuable. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in the house I'd grown up in, my father was apparently telling people that I'd moved out for some job she claims to have. According to a text my mother sent me on Wednesday asking if I was eating properly and saying that Dad was very stressed about his quarterly review coming up. I didn't respond about my father, just assured Mom I was fine and sent her a photo of my new apartment that she replied to with 3 heart emojis and nothing else. I found out later, much later, that during that same week my father had been in meetings at TechCore where Martin Chen was expressing concern about their competitive position, specifically mentioning that they were losing ground to Apex Technologies in several key areas, and my father had been confident and somewhat stressed, but not yet worried, not yet understanding how thoroughly his world and mine were about to collide. 2 weeks into my new role at Apex, I was finding my rhythm in a way I'd never experienced before. Coming into the office each morning with this genuine excitement about the problems I'd be working on, and the colleagues who actually listened when I contributed ideas during meetings. And I'd been assigned to a major project, analyzing data patterns for one of our key clients. Working with a team of 4 other analysts who treated me like a peer, rather than the inexperienced newcomer I sometimes still felt like in my more uncertain moments. We were in our weekly team meeting on a Thursday morning, sitting around the conference table with David leading the discussion about project timelines and deliverables, when he mentioned that we'd be presenting our preliminary findings to the client the following week, and I was taking notes and nodding along until David said, "Emma, I think you should take the lead on the presentation since the pattern recognition analysis was primarily your work." And I felt this surge of pride mixed with nervousness, because presenting to clients was significant responsibility, especially for someone who'd been there less than a month. I was about to thank him and agree when Jennifer, one of the senior analysts on the team, pulled up the client file on the screen and said, "We'll be meeting with their operations team at TechCore's main office." And the words hit me like cold water, my pen freezing mid-word on my notepad as my brain tried to process what I'd just heard. TechCore Industries, my father's company. The room seemed to tilt slightly as David continued talking about the presentation format and timing, and I must have looked stricken because he paused and asked if I was all right, and I managed to say, "Can I see the attendee list for the meeting?" Trying to keep my voice steady and professional, even as my heart was hammering against my ribs. David pulled up the email chain and read off the names of the TechCore team members who'd be attending: Martin Chen, VP of Operations; Susan Rodriguez from Process Improvement; James Liu from Data Systems; and Richard Morrison, Senior Operations Manager. My father. I heard someone asking me a question, but the words were muffled like I was underwater. And then David was looking at me with concern and saying, "Emma, you just went completely pale. Do you need some water?" And I realized I had to say something, had to explain why hearing my father's name on that list had knocked the air out of my lungs. I took a breath and said as calmly as I could manage, "Richard Morrison is my father." And the room went quiet for a moment before David said, "Oh," in this tone that suggested he was rapidly reassessing the situation, and Jennifer looked between us confused while the other team members shifted uncomfortably. David asked if we could speak privately, and I followed him to his office, my legs feeling unsteady, and once the door was closed, he asked me to explain the situation, and I found myself telling him more than I'd intended about my father's dismissal of my job offer, his conviction that my position at Apex wasn't real, the air quotes and the comments about me being scammed and not understanding how the corporate world worked. David listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from surprise to something like understanding sympathy, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Emma, you're absolutely the right person to deliver this presentation. Your analysis is solid and insightful, and frankly, it's unusual for us to give a new hire this much client-facing responsibility, but you've earned it." And then he paused and added, "However, I can certainly have someone else present if this situation would be too uncomfortable. There's no judgment either way." I sat there in his office looking out the window at the downtown skyline, thinking about my father's face across a conference table, thinking about standing in front of him and his boss and his colleagues, and presenting analysis they needed. And I realized with sudden startling clarity that I wanted to do this presentation, not to prove anything to him, but because it was my work, and I'd done it well, and I wasn't going to hide or defer or make myself smaller because he might be in the room. I looked at David and said, "I'll do it. I want to present." And I heard the certainty in my own voice, and felt something settle in my chest, like a decision that had been waiting to be made for much longer than just this moment. The week leading up to the presentation felt simultaneously endless and far too short, and I threw myself into preparation with an intensity that had nothing to do with my father and everything to do with the fact that this was my job, my work, my analysis that would be presented to a client who was paying Apex for insights and solutions. I spent hours refining my slides, running through the data visualizations to make sure every chart was clear and every conclusion was supported by evidence, rehearsing my explanations of the predictive algorithms I'd developed and the cost-saving recommendations that had emerged from the pattern analysis. And David reviewed my presentation twice, and both times told me it was excellent, that I should trust my expertise and deliver it with confidence. I hadn't spoken to my family since moving out 3 weeks earlier, except for occasional texts from my mother asking if I was eating enough and saying she missed me. Messages I responded to with reassurances and deflections because I wasn't ready to have any deeper conversation about why I'd left or what my father had said. And there had been nothing at all from my father himself. No apology or acknowledgement or even basic inquiry about whether I was alive and employed. On Tuesday evening, 3 days before the presentation, I left work early and went to the salon I'd been eyeing since moving to my new neighborhood. A sleek, modern place where I'd never have spent money during my months of unemployment, and I got my hair trimmed and styled and sat under the dryer, feeling like I was performing some ritual of preparation that was partly professional and partly about claiming space for myself in a world that had made me feel small for so long. I picked out my best outfit the night before the presentation, the charcoal gray suit I'd bought for interviews, and a deep blue blouse that Maya had told me made me look competent and powerful, and I laid them out on the chair in my bedroom with my portfolio bag and the printed copies of my presentation deck, everything ready so I wouldn't have to think about it in the morning when my nerves would likely be screaming. Maya came over that evening with Thai food and a bottle of wine, and we sat on my small balcony overlooking the street, and she asked me how I was feeling, really feeling, and I admitted I was terrified not of the presentation itself, but of seeing my father's face, of the moment when he would have to reconcile his dismissal of my imaginary job with the reality of me standing in front of his boss delivering professional analysis his company needed. Maya said something I've never forgotten. She said, "Emma, after tomorrow you're free, because either he'll finally see you or he won't, but either way you'll know you don't need him to see you for it to be real." And I felt tears starting and blinked them back, because I'd already cried enough over my father's inability to recognize my worth, and I didn't want to give him any more of my tears. I rehearsed my presentation one final time after Maya left, standing in my living room with my laptop open and speaking out loud to my empty apartment. And I practiced until nearly midnight, when I finally forced myself to close the computer and go to bed. Lying awake in the darkness thinking about how tomorrow would be a turning point, whether I wanted it to be or not, the moment when my professional life and my family life would collide in a conference room at TechCore Industries, and I would have to stand there and be competent and composed, regardless of whatever my father's face revealed about what he was thinking or feeling, or finally understanding about the daughter he'd never bothered to actually see. The morning of the presentation, I woke at 5:30 without needing my alarm, my body thrumming with nervous energy that made lying in bed impossible, and I went through my routine with methodical precision, showering and dressing in the suit I'd laid out, and checking my reflection 3 times to make sure I looked competent and professional, and like someone who belonged in a conference room full of senior managers. The Apex team met at the office at 8 to review the presentation one final time and load everything onto laptops with backup drives because technical failures were unacceptable when meeting with major clients. And David gave me an encouraging nod and said, "You've got this, Emma. Just present it exactly like you did in rehearsal." And I felt grateful for his steady confidence, even as my stomach twisted with anticipation. We arrived at TechCore Industries at 9:15 for our 9:30 meeting. Walking through the lobby, I'd heard my father describe countless times over the years, past the security desk and up the elevator to the 4th floor where the executive conference rooms were located, and I focused on breathing evenly and reviewing my talking points mentally while Jennifer made small talk with Dr. Woods about the traffic. The conference room was impressive with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline and a massive table that could seat 20 people, and as we entered I saw them immediately, the TechCore team already seated on the far side, and my eyes found my father before I could stop myself, saw him glance up from his phone and then freeze as his face registered complete shock, his eyes widening and his mouth actually opening slightly as he stared at me, walking in with the Apex delegation. The moment felt suspended in time, watching his expression cycle through confusion and disbelief, and something I couldn't quite identify. And then Martin Chen was standing and coming around the table with his hand extended, and I had to switch into professional mode. Had to be Emma Morrison, the senior data analyst, and not Emma Morrison, the daughter who'd never been good enough. Dr. Woods handled the introduction smoothly, gesturing to our team and saying, "I'm Patricia Woods, CEO of Apex Technologies, and this is David Park, who leads our analytics division, Jennifer Chen, our senior data architect, and Emma Morrison, one of our newest senior analysts who's been leading this analysis." And I watched my father's face pale visibly at the word senior, watched him realize this wasn't some entry-level position or administrative role, but exactly what I'd told him it was 3 weeks ago when he'd laughed in my face. Martin Chen shook my hand and said warmly, "Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Morrison," and then paused as the name registered and he turned to look at my father and said with obvious surprise, "Morrison? Richard, is this your daughter? You didn't mention she worked at Apex." And there was this terrible moment where everyone in the room was looking at my father waiting for his response while he sat there clearly struggling to formulate words, his face flushed and his hands gripping the edge of the table. He managed to say, "Yes, Emma is my daughter," in a voice that sounded strained and uncertain, and Martin's face lit up with delight as he said, "Well, this is wonderful. Small world indeed. Richard, you must be incredibly proud." And I watched my father's mouth work silently before he forced something like a smile and said, "Yes, of course," though the words came out hollow and automatic. I exchanged professional handshakes with the rest of the TechCore team, including Susan Rodriguez and James Liu, and when I reached my father last, he stood awkwardly and extended his hand, and we shook like strangers, like professionals who'd never met before, and I looked him directly in the eyes for just a second and saw something crumbling there behind his careful expression. We all took our seats with the Apex team on one side of the table and TechCore on the other, my father sitting 2 seats down from Martin Chen and staring at the folder in front of him like it contained instructions for how to process what was happening. And David opened the meeting with pleasantries about the partnership between our companies before turning to me and saying, "Emma, why don't you walk us through your findings?" And I stood and moved to the front of the room where the large screen was mounted, connecting my laptop and pulling up the first slide of my presentation while every person in that room watched me and waited. including my father, who still looked like he'd been hit by something unexpected and devastating. I clicked to the first slide and began my presentation, and the moment I started speaking about the data architecture and analytical methodology, I felt the familiar ground of my expertise solidify beneath me, the nervousness transforming into focused energy as I walked through the initial findings about operational inefficiencies in TechCore's supply chain management and the predictive models I developed to forecast cost overruns before they occurred. Martin Chen leaned forward almost immediately, his eyes moving between my slides and his own notes, and he interrupted after my third slide to ask, "Can you explain how your algorithm accounts for seasonal variation in supplier reliability?" And I answered without hesitation, explaining the multivariable regression analysis and the weighting system I'd applied to historical data spanning 5 years. And I saw him nod with satisfaction and write something down. Susan Rodriguez asked about the confidence intervals on my predictions, and I pulled up the supplementary slide I'd prepared specifically for technical questions, showing the statistical modeling and explaining that we were operating at 93% confidence for the 6-month forecast window and 87% for the 12-month projections. James Liu wanted to know about implementation timeline, and I walked through the phased approach Apex was recommending, showing how TechCore could integrate the new monitoring systems with their existing infrastructure without disrupting current operations. And I could feel the room's energy shifting as they realized this wasn't just theoretical analysis, but practical, actionable intelligence they could use immediately. My father sat silent through all of this, his eyes fixed on me but his face unreadable, not asking questions or making comments, just watching as I answered every technical challenge his colleagues posed and demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise he'd insisted I didn't possess. I moved through the cost-saving projections, showing how implementing our recommendations could save TechCore an estimated $2.4 million annually through reduced waste and optimized vendor negotiations, and Martin actually smiled at that number and said, "This is exactly what we needed. This is the kind of insight we've been trying to develop internally for months." And I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with my father and everything to do with knowing my work was genuinely valuable. When I reached the final slide summarizing key recommendations, Martin said, "Emma, this is impressive work, really impressive. How long have you been in the field?" And I explained about my master's degree in data science from Northwestern, about my thesis research on predictive analytics in supply chain optimization that had actually won a departmental award. And I watched Martin's eyebrows rise as he turned to my father and said, "Richard, you never told me your daughter was in data science, and at Apex, you must be incredibly proud." And there was this excruciating pause where everyone waited for my father's response. He forced something like a smile, his face still pale, and mumbled, "Yes, of course, very proud," but the words sounded hollow and stiff, and obviously uncomfortable. And I saw Martin's expression shift slightly as he registered the awkwardness, but chose not to pursue it. The meeting concluded with handshakes all around, and Martin made a point of approaching me specifically to say, "Outstanding presentation, Emma. Really top-tier analysis." And then he turned to Dr. Woods and asked, "How did you find her? We've been trying to recruit talent like this for years." And Patricia responded smoothly, "Rigorous interview process, Martin. We see hundreds of candidates, but Emma stood out immediately. Both her technical skills and her practical problem-solving were exceptional. She's exactly the kind of analyst we build our teams around." Martin looked at my father with something that might have been knowing amusement or might have been genuine warmth and said, "You raised her right, Richard. She's a credit to you." And I watched my father nod mechanically, while his hands gripped his portfolio case, and I felt vindication washing over me in waves. Not because Martin had praised me to my father, but because I had proven to myself and to everyone in that room that my competence was real and substantial and undeniable, that the job wasn't imaginary, and my abilities weren't wishful thinking, and my success wasn't some accident or scam, but the direct result of years of education and effort that my father had dismissed as expensive daydreaming. We left TechCore at 11:30 and rode back to Apex in 2 cars, and I sat in the back seat next to Jennifer while David drove and Dr. Woods made phone calls in the front passenger seat, and Jennifer leaned over and whispered, "You absolutely crushed that, Emma. Martin Chen looked like he wanted to hire you away from us." And I felt the adrenaline that had sustained me through the presentation finally beginning to ebb, leaving me shaky and exhausted and exhilarated all at once. Back at the office, the team gathered in the conference room for a debrief, and David said, "That was exactly what we needed, Emma. You represented Apex perfectly." And Dr. Woods added, "Martin was extremely impressed. You should be proud of that work." And I thanked them while my mind kept replaying the look on my father's face when Martin had asked why he'd never mentioned his daughter worked at Apex. That moment of exposed discomfort when his carefully constructed professional image had cracked in front of his boss. I spent the afternoon responding to emails and updating project documentation, trying to focus on work, but finding my thoughts drifting back to that conference room, to the vindication I'd felt presenting analysis my father had insisted I wasn't capable of producing. And around 3 o'clock, David stopped by my desk and said, "I just got off the phone with Martin Chen. He called specifically to tell me how valuable your presentation was and to say TechCore wants to move forward with all our recommendations." And I felt a surge of professional pride that had nothing to do with my father, and everything to do with knowing my work had genuine impact. I stayed at the office until 6, later than necessary, but reluctant to go home to my quiet apartment, where I'd have nothing to do but think about what had happened, and when I finally did leave and drive back to my building and climb the stairs to my second-floor unit, I felt the exhaustion settling into my bones, the emotional weight of the day finally catching up to me. I ordered takeout and ate it sitting on my couch, still wearing my presentation clothes, scrolling through my phone without really seeing anything. And at 8:15 my phone rang, with a call from a number I recognized immediately, even though I'd told myself I wouldn't answer if he called. But I found myself picking up anyway, and saying hello, in a voice that sounded calmer than I felt. My father's voice came through uncertain and strained, nothing like his usual confident tone, and he said, "Emma, it's Dad. Do you have a minute to talk?" And I said yes, and waited while he struggled with whatever he'd called to say, the silence stretching awkwardly between us, until he finally said, "I wanted to call and say that your presentation today was very professional. You clearly know what you're doing." And I could hear how much the admission cost him, how difficult it was for him to acknowledge he'd been wrong. I didn't make it easy for him, didn't rush to fill the silence or accept the half apology, and after another pause he said, "I may have underestimated your qualifications. I can see now that Apex made a good decision hiring you." And I felt anger flaring, because even now he couldn't fully apologize, couldn't admit that he'd been cruel and dismissive and wrong about me for months. And I said quietly, "Dad, I didn't succeed to prove anything to you. I succeeded because I'm good at what I do, because I worked hard and earned my degree and my position. And your approval or lack of it doesn't change any of that." He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I know, I realize that now, and I'm sorry I didn't see it before." And the apology was incomplete and inadequate, but it was more than he'd ever given me before. And I felt something shifting inside me, some desperate need for his validation, finally loosening its grip, because I'd proven to myself that I didn't need him to believe in me for my success to be real. We talked for another 10 minutes, awkward and careful, and he asked if I'd be willing to come to dinner sometime, said my mother missed me and wanted to see me, and I said I'd think about it. But I needed time, needed to establish that any relationship we rebuilt would be on new terms where he treated me with respect, and he agreed with a humility I'd never heard from him before.